Plenty of people like horror movies, but it can be so hard to transition from liking horror movies to liking horror books. So if that sounds like you, I have 5 recommendations for books to read based on your favorite horror movie. One of my best pieces of advice for people who want to read more is to read more in the genre of movies that they like. I find that if you like the standards and conventions of those movies, you'll also find that you like those books. So I chose 5 horror movies to help kind of get you started exploring the horror book genre. So for these 5 books, I kind of simplified them down to their most like basic level of what I hear people say when they talk about why they like these movies. And so for each of those, I used that criteria to then try to find a horror book that kind of matched that same element. So first up is the favorite horror movie of almost all of my students, and that is The Conjuring. And so for this one, I tried to narrow it down into possession and haunted house type of stories. So if you like The Conjuring, I think you would like Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. In A Head Full of Ghosts, a daughter of a family who is struggling very financially starts to experience signs of extreme mental illness, which leads them to believe that she may be possessed. And their journey is then documented on a reality television show. Throughout this whole book, you're kind of wondering, is she mentally ill? Is she possessed? Where does the truth lie here? This is extremely similar to the plot of A Conjuring 2. So I would argue that this book is modeled after The Conjuring 2. That family in real life is always kind of questioned about obviously whether or not she was really possessed and if the family was just publicizing their daughter for the money. So obviously there's the possession element. I also think there's some haunted house elements in there, right? Is it really haunted? The story is told through the perspective of the youngest daughter and kind of her thoughts as a young girl as she's experiencing all of this, and as she's also experiencing some paranormal activity within the house. This is frequently cited as one of the scariest books that people have read in horror Reddit. So I don't know if I particularly felt that way, but it definitely exemplifies the reason that I hear people like The Conjuring a lot. So my next movie that I want to talk about is Scream, and I've kind of identified this one as smart camp. I think that people really love that twist ending and all of its commentary on horror movies. So for this, I'm recommending Horror Store by Grady Hendrix. Really, any book by Grady Hendrix would kind of satisfy that. They're all very smart, they're all kind of a little funny, and they're all kind of making fun of something very traditional in horror. Horror Store is currently the only one I've actually read, which is why that's the one I'm particularly recommending, but all of his books, from what I hear, do this really well. Horror Store takes place in a fictionalized version of an IKEA, and the issue that it's taking up is how capitalism kind of works us till we're dead. And Grady Hendrix takes that idea and really expands on it in this in a funny and unique way, while also being really terrifying at the same time, which is why I think that Scream fans will like Horror Story, and again, really anything by Grady Hendrix. Alright, my next movie is one that I think was my favorite horror movie for a really, really long time, and that is Insidious. And I boiled this movie to encompass anything very traditionally paranormal. Ghosts, demons, anything in that realm. So for this one, I'm going to recommend Ghost Eaters by Clay McLeod Chapman. So in this book, there's a drug that you can take that will help you see the afterlife and see dead people around you. And our main character starts taking this drug as a way to cope after the loss of her boyfriend, but eventually she becomes very addicted to it. I thought this book was incredibly unique, which is why I want to recommend it to tons of people. I haven't really seen something like this done before. Not only is it super unique, but honestly, I think it's pretty scary. The way that they're able to describe the people, the dead people, the settings, is just genuinely terrifying. And it kind of reminds me, this alternate universe reminds me of the dream world in Insidious. So not only are you getting the paranormal elements in both of them, but you're also kind of getting that dream universe, dream sequence, that almost reality that's evident in both Insidious and in Ghost Eaters. So next up, we have a classic horror movie, and I chose Friday the 13th. And I identified this one as a traditional slasher. So for this one, I'm going to recommend a book that I've talked a lot about before, and I'm going to recommend This Wretched Valley by Jenny Kiefer. So not only are you getting slasher elements in both, but I also think that they have a similar setting in each of them. In Friday the 13th, obviously, it's famously set at a summer camp, isolated setting, wilderness, Meanwhile, this wretched valley is set in the Kentucky wilderness as 3 friends are trying to work on a PhD project while also trying to make their name in the world of rock climbing. In both those settings, you're getting super, super isolated places that only add to the terror of what's happening, right? You can't just run, you can't just leave because you're stuck there, right? You're in the middle of nowhere and no one is coming to help you, which I think is extremely terrifying. Not only that, but the descriptions in this wretched valley take it to the next level. Again, it's genuinely one of the scariest stories I've ever read, and I think that if you liked Friday the 13th, you might also like this wretched valley. I will add one caveat that it is a little more paranormal than Friday the 13th, so if you don't like paranormal books, I'd actually recommend Final Girls by Riley Sager instead. Now this one is definitely more of your traditional slasher. Humans are the bad guys, no paranormal activity involved here. This book is also kind of smart camp, so if you really like that one, this obviously comments on the horror trope of the final girl. In Final Girls, our main character is the sole survivor of a massacre of her friends set at a super remote cabin. Once the story begins, not only do you kind of get to learn bits and pieces of what happened to her in that remote cabin, but you also learn about her present life as she starts to meet other final girls in their situation. But someone is mysteriously killing off all of these final girls. So there's a little traditional mystery here while also elements of a slasher. Not only, and maybe this is a spoiler, it's not only a slasher in the past, but also in the present. So lots of blood, lots of stabbing. I think definitely up the alley of someone who likes Friday the 13th. All right, and then the next one is my husband's favorite classic horror movie, more traditional horror movie anyway, and that is The Thing, and I have categorized this one as a body horror. Now I say I don't read a ton of body horror, but as I was going through my Goodreads, I have accidentally read a lot of it. It's not my favorite, but again, I feel like I've read a good amount of it so that I can pass on a few recommendations in that subgenre. So the first body horror book I want to recommend is The Troop by Nick Cutter. In this book, a Boy Scout troop heads to a remote island for summer camp, essentially, and while they're there, a disease creature takes over their body and does kind of horrific things to it. I think this book showed me what my limits in horror were. So this is definitely a pretty intense read. For me, most body horror books are really intense, and I think that this book is no exception. So again, all body horror kind of really grosses me out, but this is a really good starting point if you're trying to figure out if you like body horror. There's definitely more extreme stuff out there, and I think this is a good gateway into seeing if body horror is for you. This book isn't really scary in the traditional sense. There's no jump scares, there's no, I don't know, things that go bump in the night. It really is just scary based on how he describes what is happening to them. I think this is also kind of a little mix of Lord of the Flies, so definitely interesting to see what these group of boys get up to when they are left to their own devices. So lots of elements for someone if you're looking for a Kickstarter to reading body horror books. But if you've either already read that one because it is pretty popular, or if you're looking for something just a bit more intense, I would recommend Uzumaki. This book, in so few words, is about a town that becomes obsessed with spirals. So not only is it a body horror book, but it is also a cosmic horror. You never really figure out what or why is happening to them, which is also horrifying in its own right. Kind of similar to The Thing, where you never really find out what's going on. You do get your questions answered in The Troop. You don't really get your questions answered in this one. Now this is a manga, so it is illustrated, which I think adds to the horror a bit, because you don't have to picture what horrifying things are happening to them. You get to see it. And the illustrations are disgusting, which I think is kind of what people are looking for in body horror, right? It's disgusting, so it's horrifying. I definitely didn't know what I was getting into when I read it, and if I did know, I don't know if I would have read it, because again, it's definitely more intense than The Troop, and not a huge fan of body horror. So if you do want to kind of up your body horror count, I guess, this one would be a good one to read. Thank you guys so much for watching. This was so fun to put together. Again, I love when I get to mix books and media together. Again, media studies major. I love talking about media, and I feel like this one is a good crossover where we can kind of mix both of those interests. So let me know if you would either want to watch another video with different movies, or if you want me to foray into the television series. Either way, let me know what your favorite horror television show or movie is down to kind of help guide my thoughts for this next video, and I will see you next time.